Today we're looking at Edmund Spenser's great poem, The Faerie Queene. It was envisioned as a 12-book mega epic on the virtues. And I say mega epic because the size of this thing is really something to behold. And we'll come back around to that in a moment. The first three books were presented to Queen Elizabeth I with a dedication to her that still stands in the copies we have in 1590. She is the Fairy Queen. The Fairy Queen, titular Fairy Queen, is an allegory for Queen Elizabeth. And then books 4 through 6 were presented in 1596. This is all that was finished, these first 6 books. But in 1609, several more cantos, which are generally agreed to have been the beginnings of Book 7, were published and have since become a regular part of the text. We call those the mutability cantos because they deal with the topic of mutability in that character. The text is an allegory. It represents the various virtues as knights who are facing challenges to the moral life, which are allegorically represented as fantastical creatures, sorcerers and wizards and things, or as magical challenges the knights have to overcome. That's the fairyland part of it. And in this way, I find this personally very fascinating because the picture of fairyland is that fairyland is an allegory of the real world. Fairyland is the terrain of the soul or the spiritual journey externalized. And that's what we're reading. So you have the literal level, which is meant to be a delightful story of adventures through fairy, but then you have the allegorical level, which is trying to guide the gentleman into being the best person he can be. Even though we only have the first 6.5 books, say, it's the longest poem in the Western canon, coming in at over 36,000 lines. The Iliad, for comparison, is 15,000 lines. Dante's Commedia, the entire thing, is only 14,233. So the Fairy Queen is more than twice as large as either of those. The virtues that are represented in the books that we have are holiness, temperance, chastity, friendship, justice, and courtesy, or chivalry, and, by implication, stability. Because in the cantos from Book 7, those are the mutability cantos, and so mutability is the subject, but mutability is the bad guy. It's the one that's got to be overcome, and so the opposite of mutability is really the virtue that book is about, and that's got to be something like stability. So Spenser's influences in writing this book were wide-ranging and encyclopedic. I'm tempted to say there wasn't anything that was available at the end of the 16th century in Europe that was not an influence on Spenser. He knows all of the great Latin epics. He knows all the great work of the Middle Ages. He's got Greek writers back on the table again, and so he's drawing from that. It's just truly, truly encyclopedic. But chief among them were the Italians, and specifically Ariosto and Tasso. And Tasso we'll talk about in the next video, and how wonderful his work was. But these two guys were major Italian epic poets, and they were the successors to Dante, really, and their works were enormously popular in medieval Europe. In fact, I ought to do one of these videos on Ariosto as well, because his works were so widely known and so very popular. Now, the text is really, really difficult. It's written intentionally in an archaic style, and so it harkens back to forms that are not modern English forms, but Middle English forms. Spenser loved Chaucer, and you're going to see a lot of the forms. If you were reading Chaucer in the original Middle English, you're going to see a lot of those forms in Spenser. You actually need to bring some knowledge of the Old English participial forms and whatnot into your reading of Spenser. On top of that, he's created a new type of stanza, a new meter for this poem, which is fairly heavy. And I don't want to say ponderous because I don't think it ever gets clogged down, but it's very stolid, and it can be hard for readers because a lot happens in each stanza. And then on top of all of that, the range of reference and the density of the allegory and all of that can be difficult for modern readers, especially if we're less familiar with all of the material he's drawing from to create the tapestry that is this poem. So, one of the things that I'm very, very excited about is that there is a new version of the Fairy Queen, which at the time of recording this video is about to be released here in 2025, being done by Sky Total Press. And it's a modernization, but it's a modernization done by Spenser scholars who deeply, deeply love this poem, and their desire is to represent the poem to a contemporary audience in a way that lets them experience what's unique and cool about the poem, but at the same time helps them to get over the gap of the difficulty inherent in the poem itself. And so I really hope that I think it's going to be a very good translation, a good version for people to come into Spenser and then maybe be a gateway to moving on and reading the text in its original, which is just, it's very beautiful. And if you do want to jump straight to the original, I highly recommend it. You just have to be patient. But I found that when I teach it, that by the end of book one, students have gotten acclimated to the language and to the meter and the diction, and they're doing a good job of keeping along with it. But if you want a more modernized version with just a ton of notes helping you understand what all these things are referring to, then that new edition from Sky Total Press should be really, really wonderful and helpful. This text, The Fairy Queen, was adapted numerous times for children because, fairies belong to children, and so let's do this. And there are over 20 different versions of it adapted in the 19th and 20th centuries alone. And so it's been very popular, and it's been very popular for a very long time. It is considered one of the most influential works of English poetry. I'll say that again. It's one of the most influential works of English poetry. That alone is the reason why we need to be reading it. Well, we can't afford to just relegate it to, well, I'm sure it's really great, but it's super long. Because everything after Spenser owes something of a debt to Spenser. I'll just highlight a few things. John Milton, his Paradise Lost, is heavily influenced by the Fairy Queen. In fact, John Dryden, who is another poet, he's the first poet laureate of England, he knew Milton personally, and he reports that Milton acknowledged to him that Spenser was the quote-unquote original for Paradise Lost. Now, scholars have argued for a long time, what does that mean that it's the original for Paradise Lost? What does that look like and everything? But the point is that in conversation, Milton did say to Spenser, Milton said to Dryden, Spenser's the guy. Everything that I'm doing comes from Spenser in some way. Milton himself, in his essay, The Areopagitica, he says that he thinks that Spenser is a better teacher of moral virtue than Scotus or Aquinas. And that's a pretty big statement. So you can see how big a debt Milton owes to Spenser. But it's not just Milton. The more romantic poets, many of the romantic poets were heavily influenced by Spenser, among them Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats. Now, it's impossible to talk about the influence of the Fairy Queen without taking into account a genre that is very near and dear to my own heart, and that is the genre of fantasy. It's common these days to speak of J.R.R. Tolkien as the father of modern fantasy, and if we're willing to, I think there's propriety in that. Modern fantasy, which has its own virtues and vices and practices and mores and whatnot, I think it does find its root in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit, in Tolkien's Middle-earth, shall we say. But Tolkien he got it all from Spenser. He learned how to think fantastically from Spenser, as did C.S. Lewis, George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, Lord Dunsany. All of the big names, J.M. Barrie, all of the big names in fantasy from the 19th and 20th centuries have a heavy debt to Spenser, who essentially creates the genre. And so if Tolkien's the father of modern fantasy, Spenser's the father of fantasy. And every writer, so let me say it this way, every writer of the fantastical between Spenser and Tolkien owes a large debt to Spenser. And every writer of the fantastical after Tolkien owes a large debt to Spenser through Tolkien. And then, of course, this became a very popular source of painting for the 19th century, and partly, not just painting, all the arts really. You get a lot of engravings and drawings and whatnot, because all of these editions that are being made for children are going to be illustrated. And so there's a lot of work that is done there, but also just standalone artwork, paintings done not for the purpose of books, but just to delight the imagination and remind one of this great story it's been very productive in that realm as well. So this is a poem that anyone studying English literature or any lover of stories told in the English language cannot afford to miss.